At 0150 on May 19, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton stood in the dark, cramped command center of USS England, watching a single sonar blip crawl across the black water north of Bougainville. He was 37 years old. This was his first patrol as a commanding officer. He had never sunk a submarine in his life. Mounted on his foredeck sat a weapon most captains in the Pacific Fleet still refused to trust. Depth charges had killed submarines for 30 years, 1 kill for every 60 attacks. This new weapon, a British invention called Hedgehog, had barely proven itself, a 5% success rate in early trials, dismissed by veteran commanders as a gimmick. Somewhere beneath that blip was a Japanese submarine, one of 7, stationed along a hidden line to warn Tokyo the moment America's fleet moved toward the Marianas. Pendleton had run the numbers himself. He believed the math. What he did not know was that in 12 days, his untested ship, his inexperienced crew, and his distrusted weapon would do something no vessel in naval history had ever done before, or has ever done since. At 0150 on May 19, 1944, the Combat Information Center of USS England smelled of hot coffee, machine oil, and cold sweat. The compartment was barely large enough for the men crammed inside it, lit by the dim red glow that let eyes stay adjusted to the darkness above deck. Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton leaned over the sonar operator's shoulder, close enough to hear the man's breathing change, watching a single green trace crawl across the scope. Somewhere beneath the black water north of Bougainville, something was moving at 6 knots, patient, invisible, deadly. Pendleton was 37 years old. This was his first war patrol as commanding officer of any vessel. He had never sunk a submarine. He had never even fired a shot in anger. He had spent years studying charts, tides, currents, the mathematics of sound traveling through water, preparing for a moment he was not certain would ever come. Tonight, that moment had arrived, and there was no way to know yet whether the years of preparation would matter, or whether the ocean would simply swallow the contact and disappear, the way it had swallowed so many hunters before him. USS England was not built to inspire confidence. She was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, 77 feet shorter than a fleet destroyer, thrown together in a wartime shipyard by welders who had never built a warship before her. Her steel plates still smelled faintly of fresh paint. Half her crew had never been to sea until they boarded her. Farm boys and factory workers turned sailors in a matter of months, learning the language of sonar pings and depth readings the way other men learned a foreign tongue. She carried no torpedoes worth mentioning, no heavy guns, nothing that looked like it belonged on the cover of a recruiting poster. She had exactly one purpose: hunting submarines, and on her foredeck sat the one piece of equipment that made her different from every destroyer that had come before her. 24 spigot mortars, arranged in rows, angled forward, their steel barrels catching what little moonlight slipped through the clouds. The British called it Hedgehog. Sailors who had never seen one fire called it useless, a toy dreamed up by engineers who had never stood on a heaving deck at 2 in the morning with a submarine circling beneath them. For 3 decades, the standard method of killing a submarine had been the depth charge. Roll the barrel off the stern, set the fuse to detonate at an estimated depth, and hope the submarine was still there by the time the charge went off. It was crude, loud, and comforting in its familiarity, the kind of weapon a man could trust because he had grown up watching newsreels of the explosions. The numbers told a brutal story. British forces alone had launched over 5,000 depth charge attacks during this war. Fewer than 90 had resulted in a confirmed kill. 1 kill for every 60 attempts. Worse, the explosion of a depth charge disturbed the water so violently that sonar went blind for 15 minutes afterward, the sea churning with bubbles and noise. In that blindness, submarines slipped away into the dark and were never found again, their crews listening to the fading thunder above them with something close to relief. Hedgehog worked differently. 24 projectiles, 65 pounds each, packed with 35 pounds of Torpex, fired 200 yards ahead of the ship in a tight circular pattern. They carried contact fuses. No detonation on impact with water. No wasted explosion. No blind, churning aftermath. If a projectile went off, it meant steel had met steel. Somewhere below, a hull had been breached. If nothing exploded, the ship had missed clean, and sonar contact never broke. The hunter could try again immediately, again and again, without ever losing the scent. It sounded perfect on paper. In practice, it had barely been tested. Early trials showed a 5% success rate, a number that made veteran captains shake their heads. Men who had spent years trusting the familiar thunder of depth charges looked at Hedgehog and saw an expensive toy, one more idea from a laboratory that had never been shot at. Pendleton looked at the same numbers and saw something else entirely. 1 kill for every 20 Hedgehog attacks against 1 kill for every 60 depth charge attacks. To him, the math was not complicated. It was simply better, and better was worth betting a career on. 4 days earlier, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific had intercepted and broken a transmission from the Japanese submarine I-16. Codebreakers working in windowless rooms thousands of miles from the front line had turned a string of meaningless characters into a destination, the harbor at Buin, and an arrival time, 2200 hours on May 19th. It was as close to a gift as naval intelligence ever offered a hunting ship. England and 2 sister ships had positioned themselves along I-16's projected course, and now, at 050, the gift had arrived. A contact, 6 knots, submerged, exactly where the codebreakers said it would be. The sonar operator called the range, 1,500 yards. Then the trace began to change shape. I-16 was diving, and diving hard, the classic evasive pattern of a Japanese submarine commander who suspected he was being hunted. Radical turns, changes in depth, a game of blind chess played through sound waves alone, each side trying to guess what the other could not see. At 13:41 that afternoon, after hours of patient tracking through the changing light, the tension on the bridge thick enough to taste, Pendleton ordered the first Hedgehog attack. 24 projectiles arced through the sky and vanished into the Pacific, sinking at 23 feet per second toward a target that might not even be there anymore. Silence. A clean miss. I-16 had turned at the last possible second, and somewhere below, a Japanese crew exhaled. The second attack landed 1 hit, at 130 feet. The explosion lifted England's bow out of the water and threw men against bulkheads, boots sliding on wet steel, but 1 hit was not enough to kill a submarine built to survive depth charges far more powerful. The third attack missed entirely. The fathometer told Pendleton why. I-16 had gone deeper than anyone had estimated, 325 feet down, deeper than his firing solution had accounted for, hiding in a layer of cold water that bent sound waves and blurred the picture. The fourth attack, at 14:33, missed again. I-16 had turned inside the pattern, slipping through the gap between projectiles like a man dodging raindrops in a downpour. 4 attempts, 4 failures, or near failures. On any other ship, with any other captain, this might have been the moment doubt crept in. The moment someone suggested falling back on the old depth charges, the familiar thunder that at least felt like it was doing something. Men glanced at each other in the red light of the CIC, waiting to see if their new captain would lose his nerve. Pendleton held his position and ordered a 5th attack. 24 projectiles fell through the afternoon light, 4 detonations, then a 5th. Then, seconds later, a 6th explosion, this one different from the others, deeper, heavier, wrong in a way that meant something structural had failed far below the surface. The blast that followed lifted England's stern clear out of the water. Sailors were knocked off their feet across the deck, gripping rails and hatches to keep from falling. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Then, 20 minutes later, the ocean began giving up its answer. Oil, first, spreading in a slick across the swell, catching the late sun in an ugly rainbow sheen. Then wood. Then fragments of fabric, rising slowly to the surface in the fading light. the only remains of men who had been alive and breathing minutes before. I-16 was gone. 107 men went down with her, into the same dark water that had hidden them only hours earlier. For Pendleton and his untested crew, it was proof. Proof that the weapon nobody trusted actually worked. Proof that a green captain and a green crew, on a ship considered too small and too cheap to matter, had just done something the entire Pacific Fleet would soon be talking about. On deck, men who had never seen combat stood quietly at the rail, looking at the oil slick spreading behind them, feeling something between pride and nausea, the particular silence of young men who have just taken part in killing for the first time. But there was no time to celebrate. Within hours, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific delivered a second decoded message, and this one was worse than the first. Not one submarine. 7. The Imperial Japanese Navy's 7th Submarine Squadron had deployed an entire scouting line north of the Admiralty Islands, spaced at precise intervals between Truk and the waters west of Manus. Their mission was simple and dangerous: detect any American carrier task force moving toward the Marianas or Palau, and warn Tokyo before the fleet arrived. Commander Hamilton Haynes, commanding Escort Division 39 from Tulagi, received the new intelligence and made his decision immediately. England would not return to port. She would join two sister ships, destroyer escorts George and Raby, and together the three of them would hunt down an entire submarine picket line before it could report a single American ship. 3 destroyer escorts, 7 Japanese submarines, each carrying 56 men who had trained for exactly this kind of patient, silent war. The odds, on paper, looked absurd, but Pendleton had just proven something in the dark water off Bougainville that no textbook could teach. A weapon nobody trusted, in the hands of a crew willing to trust the numbers over the tradition, could do what depth charges never could. The hunting group departed Purvis Bay at first light, the wake churning white behind 3 small ships, steaming toward a stretch of ocean where 6 more submarines were waiting, unaware that the ship now closing in on them had just written the first line of a record that would never be broken. The hunting group ran a line of bearing formation through the dark, 16,000 yards between each ship, radar sweeping every 30 seconds, sonar pinging into the black water below. Somewhere ahead of them, 7 submarines had been stationed at precise intervals along a scouting line stretching from Truk to the waters west of Manus, each one waiting for a glimpse of an American carrier task force so it could radio a warning back to Tokyo before the fleet ever arrived. Admiral Soemu Toyota needed eyes on the ocean. These submarines were those eyes. England, George, and Raby intended to close every one of them. The Japanese commanders had gone silent now. No more careless transmissions for Fleet Radio Unit Pacific to intercept. No more gift-wrapped coordinates. From here on, the Americans would have to find their targets the old way, through patience, electronics, and mathematics, the same tools that had already claimed I-16. At Cerro 350 on May 22nd, George's radar caught a surface contact at 15,000 yards. A submarine running on the surface to recharge her batteries, confident in the darkness, unaware that steel eyes were already watching her from beyond the horizon. This was RO-106. The searchlight found her first. Within 90 seconds she had crash-dived, seawater flooding her ballast tanks, her bow angling down into the deep. George fired Hedgehog at 0415. 24 projectiles splashed into the dark and sank without a sound. A clean miss. It fell to England to finish what George had started. Sonar regained contact at 0425, range 1,400 yards, and the pattern that followed was becoming horribly familiar. RO-106 ran deep, turned hard, changed her depth without warning. Every maneuver a calculated gamble that the Americans could not track her closely enough to land a killing blow. The first attack missed. The submarine had turned 30 degrees during the 9 seconds it took the projectiles to sink, enough time to slide 150 feet clear of the pattern. The second attack came at 0501. 24 projectiles fell through the darkness in their tight circle. 3 detonations. Then, a heartbeat later, a 4th explosion far larger than the others, a deep concussive roar that rolled across the surface and reached George and Raby 4,000 yards away, felt as a shudder through their own hulls. At sunrise, the proof spread across half a mile of ocean. Oil, timber, twisted metal. No survivors rose to argue otherwise. RO-106 was gone. Kill number 2, 24 hours after the first. The 3 ships reformed their line and pressed on, the crews now trading exhausted, disbelieving glances. 2 submarines in 2 engagements. Somewhere ahead, 5 more waited, each one a fresh gamble, each one a fresh chance for the numbers to turn against them. At 0600 on May 23rd, Raby's radar found another contact, 22,000 yards out. This one dove before anyone could get a clear look at her, and whoever commanded her had clearly heard what happened to the last 2 submarines that surfaced carelessly in these waters. She stayed deep. She stayed erratic. This was RO-104, and her captain intended to make the Americans pay for every yard of progress. Raby fired 4 Hedgehog attacks beginning at 0617. 4 misses. RO-104 turned inside every pattern, reading the American attacks and slipping the gap each time. George took her turn next. 4 more attacks between 07117 and 0810. 4 more misses. This Japanese commander was good, patient, precise, turning at the exact moment his instincts told him the projectiles were falling. Division Commander Haynes watched from George's bridge as England prepared to take her turn. 2 kills belonged to England already. Raby and George had none. Whatever the reason, better sonar operators, faster Hedgehog crews, a captain willing to trust the numbers over his gut, England had become the killer of this hunting group, and everyone on all 3 ships knew it. There was no resentment in it, only the particular relief of tired men handing a hard job to whoever had already shown they could do it. Haynes picked up the radio handset and gave an order that would be repeated in wardrooms and reunions for decades afterward. 5 words, half exasperation, half respect. Go ahead, England. Aboard England herself, the crew barely needed the order. They had already begun tracking RO-104 on their own scope the moment Raby's 4th attack failed. Sonar operators calling out range and bearing before Pendleton had even finished reading the transmission from George. 2 kills in 3 days had changed something in these men. The nervous, uncertain silence that had filled the CIC during the hunt for I-16 was gone, replaced by a grim, businesslike quiet, the sound of a crew that had stopped wondering whether the weapon worked and started simply trusting that it would. Pendleton's first attack missed, RO-104 turning at the last instant, just as she had against Raby and George. But the second attack, at 0834, landed 10 detonations, perhaps 12, the explosions blending into a single continuous roar that rattled teeth and windows alike. Then came a different sound entirely, metal tearing, bulkheads collapsing under pressure, the groan of a hull failing in the deep. 3 minutes later, a final, massive explosion confirmed what everyone already suspected. Her batteries had ruptured. Oil and debris surfaced at 10:45. Kill number 3. 72 hours, 3 submarines, 163 Japanese sailors gone into the same dark water that had once hidden them so well, and 4 submarines remained on the line ahead, each one still unaware that the ship hunting them had, in 3 days, turned an untested weapon into the deadliest tool in the Pacific Fleet. At 0120 on May 24th, George's radar found RO-116 on the surface, 15,000 yards out. She dove at 0130. England had sonar contact by 0150, and the pattern seemed set to repeat itself exactly as before, until this Japanese commander made a choice none of the others had made. Instead of diving deep, 300 feet, 400 feet, burying himself under every possible cushion of water, he stayed shallow, only 150 feet down, betting that the Americans had calibrated their weapons for a deep target and would fire over his head. It was a clever bet. It was also a fatal one. Pendleton's sonar operator caught the unusually shallow depth immediately and the firing solution adjusted before the first projectiles ever left the launcher. The attack at 0214 produced 3 detonations, perhaps 5, nothing like the thunderous secondary explosions of the previous 2 kills. Just the flat, ugly sound of steel projectiles punching straight through a pressure hull at over 700 feet per second, opening holes barely 3 inches wide. At 150 feet of depth, seawater pours through a hole that size at a rate that gives a crew no real chance. The submarine settled lower as she flooded, and the deeper she sank, the harder the sea pressed in through the wounds in her hull. More water, more weight, more depth. A spiral with only one ending. Temperatures inside her hull climbed by hundreds of degrees as pressure and friction did their work. Within 6 minutes, everyone aboard was gone. Oil surfaced after dawn, thin at first, then spreading over the following day into a slick, several square miles wide. 56 more men. Kill number 4. 5 days. 4 submarines sunk. Word of it reached Washington faster than anyone expected. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, the officer who held ultimate responsibility for every ship flying the American flag, read the action reports at his desk and found himself looking at a number that seemed almost impossible. 1 small destroyer escort, 4 confirmed kills, 5 days. A weapon most captains in the fleet still would not have trusted with their own lives. The story of England's success spread through the Pacific Fleet within hours, and with it came exactly the kind of attention nobody in the middle of a hunt actually wants. On May 25th, Admiral Halsey decided England had proven enough. Pull her from submarine hunting, he ordered. Reassign her to carrier escort duty. 4 kills had made her crew some of the most experienced submarine hunters in the entire Navy, and experienced crews were rare, valuable, worth protecting rather than risking on 3 more targets still hiding somewhere along the line. Commander Haynes refused the order. 3 submarines remained unaccounted for: RO-105, RO-108, and RO-109. England had already killed 4 in 5 days. If the pace held, she could finish the job in 3 more. Pull her now, and the remaining submarines would simply keep reporting American fleet movements straight back to Tokyo, and the entire intelligence advantage bought by the codebreakers back in Hawaii would be wasted. Halsey relented. 1 more patrol. At 23:03 on May 26th, Raby picked up radar contact on a submarine 110 nautical miles northeast of Seidler Harbor, range 15,000 yards. This was RO-108. She dove immediately, and England gained sonar contact at 1,650 yards. Her captain made the same mistake RO-116 had made 4 days earlier, staying shallow, turning hard, believing depth alone would not save him, but confidence in evasive maneuvers might. Pendleton's crew had hunted 4 submarines by now. They knew every trick a frightened commander might try. Raby fired first and missed. Haynes gave the same order he had given 3 days before. Go ahead, England. At 23:23, England's Hedgehog projectiles fell through the darkness and found their mark almost immediately. 4 hits, perhaps 6, the explosions coming so close together they merged into a single continuous roar. RO-108 did not slowly flood and settle the way the earlier kills had. She broke apart at once, her pressure hull failing at multiple points in the same instant. 56 men died before they had time to understand what was happening to them. Kill number 5. 6 days into the hunt, 279 Japanese sailors now lost to a weapon their own navy did not yet know existed. In Tokyo, at Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, Admiral Toyota studied the patrol reports from his scouting line and found only silence where 5 submarines should have been reporting. No distress calls, no emergency transmissions, just 5 gaps in the line where contact should have continued, 1 submarine falling silent roughly every 24 hours. The pattern was unmistakable even without knowing the cause. Something out there was killing his submarines faster than any depth-charge crew in naval history ever had. For Toyota, the silence meant more than 5 lost crews. It meant his eyes on the American fleet were disappearing one by one, at precisely the moment he most needed warning of where the next invasion would fall, on Saipan, on Guam, on Palau, or somewhere else entirely. Every submarine that stopped reporting was a blind spot opening in the middle of the Pacific, and he had no way of knowing whether the next report would come from a survivor or whether the silence itself was the only report he would ever get. New orders went out to the two submarines still on the line, RO-105 and RO-109. Patrol at 400 feet minimum. Surface only when absolutely necessary to recharge batteries. Abandon radical evasive maneuvers entirely, since sharp turns only made noise, and noise only gave the American sonar operators a clearer target to track. Run silent instead. The Japanese Navy was learning, but it was learning from the deaths of men who could no longer report what had actually gone wrong. England, George, and Raby pushed on, deeper into a patch of ocean roughly 3,000 square miles wide, searching for two submarines that had finally learned to disappear. 5 kills had already emptied a significant portion of England's Hedgehog magazine. 120 rounds fired of the 240 she carried, leaving enough for perhaps 5 more attacks if her crew loaded with care. The Japanese were adapting. The Americans were running low on ammunition. And somewhere in that vast, dark stretch of the Pacific, RO-105 was waiting, running silent, about to give Pendleton's crew the hardest fight of the entire 12 days. On May 30th, George's radar caught RO-105 at 21:45. This time her captain did something none of the others had tried. He took her down to 400 feet, then stopped every engine, every motor, every source of vibration a sonar operator might latch onto. No propeller noise, no machinery hum. Nothing but the ambient sound of the ocean itself. England's sonar picked up only a weak, intermittent signal, a smear of disturbed water the crew called a knuckle, the submarine's true position hidden somewhere within a couple hundred yards of it. Pendleton faced a choice that would have been unthinkable 5 days earlier. Fire on a weak, uncertain contact and likely waste precious Hedgehog rounds, or wait, hold position, and let the Japanese commander choose the moment he finally had to move. Pendleton chose to wait. 4 hours passed in near-total silence, the crew watching a scope that showed almost nothing, listening for a sound that refused to come. Somewhere below them, 56 Japanese sailors sat in the dark, batteries draining, air growing thin, waiting out the same silence from the other direction, each side betting the other would break first. Then, at 02:30 on May 31st, the signal on England's sonar scope strengthened. RO-105 was moving again. Her batteries had run down to the point where her captain had no choice left. Surface, recharge, or die slowly in the dark with no power at all. He chose to surface, and he chose one final gamble along with it, a gamble that almost worked. During those 4 silent hours, the ocean current had carried the submarine nearly 3 miles from her last known position without her engines ever turning over. When she broke the surface at 03:15, George's radar caught her at 13,000 yards, in the wrong direction entirely from where the hunting group had been concentrating its search. For a few critical minutes, 3 American ships were looking at the wrong patch of ocean, and RO-105's captain had bought himself the one thing he needed most: time. By the time England turned toward the new contact, RO-105 had already crash-dived again, and in the 90 seconds that dive bought her, she pushed another 10% of charge into her batteries, enough to run, enough to fight for her life a while longer. England regained sonar contact at 03:45. The submarine was running deep and fast now, 6 knots, heading northeast, away from the ships that had already killed 4 of her sisters. This commander was different from the others. He had clearly studied what happened to RO-106, RO-104, RO-116, and RO-108. He understood that staying deep bought time, that running fast bought distance, that erratic speed changes bought confusion. He gave Pendleton's crew nothing easy. The mathematics themselves were working against the Americans now in a way they had not before. A Hedgehog projectile sank at 23 feet per second, and at 400 feet of depth, that meant 17 seconds between the moment the mortars fired and the moment the projectiles reached their target. In 17 seconds, a submarine moving at 6 knots could travel 170 feet, more than enough distance to slip clear of even a well-aimed circular pattern. Predicting exactly where a fast, evasive submarine would be 17 seconds into the future was no longer simple mathematics. It was closer to guesswork, dressed up as mathematics. And guesswork had a way of failing at the worst possible moment. The first attack, at 0400, missed by 200 feet. RO-105 had turned hard during the fall of the projectiles, exactly the kind of maneuver her captain had been forbidden to use just days earlier, and exactly the kind of maneuver he now used anyway, because staying alive mattered more than following orders written by men who were not the ones being hunted. The second attack, at 0423, missed by 100 feet, closer but still nothing. The submarine kept varying her speed, 6 knots, then 4, then back to 6, refusing to settle into any pattern the Americans could exploit. England had now fired 48 Hedgehog projectiles chasing this single submarine. Out of the 240 rounds she had carried at the start of the patrol, only 72 remained. 3 more full attacks, perhaps 3.5 if the loading crew worked with unusual care and unusual luck. 3 more chances to finish what 4 previous kills had made look almost routine, against an opponent who was, by a wide margin, the best the hunting group had faced in 12 days. Aboard George, Commander Haynes watched the engagement stretch on longer than any of the previous 5. The earlier kills had taken 2 attacks, 3 at most. RO-105 had already survived 2 and was heading toward a third, maybe a fourth, and every attack fired was one closer to the moment England simply ran out of weapons to fire. For the first time since the hunt began, the mathematics that had favored the Americans all along seemed to be tilting back the other way, and there was nothing left to do but keep tracking, keep calculating, and wait to see which side the numbers finally landed on. At 0447, Pendleton's sonar operator noticed something. RO-105 was turning every 4 minutes, 30 degrees to port, then 30 degrees to starboard, back again, a rhythm repeating itself almost exactly. Her captain believed he was maneuvering randomly, unpredictably, the way a hunted man is supposed to move. But men under pressure rarely manage true randomness. They fall into rhythms without realizing it, the same instinct repeating itself over and over because the mind, under enough stress, reaches for the familiar. Pendleton adjusted the firing solution around that rhythm, calculating the turn before it happened, leading the target by 200 feet instead of aiming at where she currently was. It was the kind of decision that either proved a captain right or ended a hunt in humiliating failure, and there was no way to know which until the projectiles hit the water. By now, England's crew had been at general quarters for the better part of 12 days, sleeping in short, broken stretches between contacts, eating cold food at battle stations, their eyes rimmed red from staring at scopes in the dark. 4 kills had turned them from green recruits into the most experienced submarine hunters in the Pacific Fleet, but experience did not erase exhaustion, and exhaustion had a way of making a man's hands shake at exactly the moment they needed to be steady. Third Hedgehog attack, 0508. 24 projectiles fell in their tight circle through the graying pre-dawn light. This time, 4 detonations rippled up through the water, close together, unmistakable. But no secondary explosion followed, no ruptured battery, no shattered pressure hull venting its last breath toward the surface. RO-105 had been hit, wounded, but she was still moving, still running, refusing to die as cleanly as the 4 submarines before her. 64 Hedgehog projectiles remained in England's magazine. 2 more full attacks, perhaps a fragment of a third if the loading crew could scrape together enough rounds from what was left in the racks below deck. 5 clean kills in 11 days had made this hunting group look unstoppable, to everyone back at Purvis Bay and Tulagi, to everyone reading the action reports in Washington. 1 botched final engagement, 1 submarine that slipped away after burning through nearly all of England's ammunition, would not erase those 5 kills, but it would leave a crack in a record that, until this moment, had looked flawless. On George's Bridge, Commander Haynes said nothing over the radio. There was nothing useful left to say. The mathematics had carried England through 5 kills already. The sonar tracking, the firing solutions, the patient reading of a frightened man's instincts translated into numbers on a plotting board. Either the mathematics would hold one more time, against the most careful and disciplined submarine commander of the entire 12 days, or they would not, and either way, dawn was already breaking over a stretch of the Pacific that had swallowed 5 Japanese submarines in 11 days, and was not yet finished deciding the fate of a 6th. The 4th Hedgehog attack fell at 05:32. 8 detonations, close together, unmistakable this time, the sound every man aboard England had learned to recognize after 5 days of listening for it. RO-105's pressure hull gave way at multiple points at once. Somewhere below, her captain was already fighting to blow ballast, to force compressed air into flooded tanks, to buy his crew the seconds they needed to reach the surface and abandon ship before the water finished what the projectiles had started. He never got the chance. The flooding outpaced every emergency procedure his crew could execute. The submarine that had outlasted 3 separate attacks, that had drifted silently for 4 hours to buy herself time, that had turned and varied her speed with more discipline than any of the 5 submarines before her, went under before her own crew could open a single hatch to the surface. Oil and debris broke the surface at 06:15, just after sunrise, spreading slowly across water that had already swallowed 5 of her sisters in the previous 11 days. On England's deck, exhausted men who had barely slept in 12 days stood at the rail again, watching the same ugly rainbow sheen they had watched 5 times before. Too tired now for the disbelief that had followed the first kill, too experienced for anything but a quiet, worn-out recognition of what they had just finished. Kill number 6, 12 days, 6 submarines, 335 Japanese sailors gone, and a record no navy in the history of anti-submarine warfare had ever come close to matching. Only 1 submarine from the original scouting line remained unaccounted for, RO-109. She was never found. Word of the massacre along her own patrol line had reached her captain by radio in the days after RO-108's death. The new orders to run silent and deep clearly meant to save exactly 1 boat from a fate that had already claimed 5 others. RO-109 abandoned her station, slipped east toward Truk, and survived the war entirely, her crew living out the remaining 15 months of the conflict, never fully understanding how close they had come to sharing the fate of their 5 sister submarines. Her crew would not learn the full scope of what had happened until months later, when Japan surrendered in August 1945 and the paperwork of a lost war finally came out into the open, revealing 6 submarines and 335 men lost to a single American destroyer escort, using a weapon most Japanese commanders had never even heard of. For the survivors of RO-109, the news must have arrived less like history and more like a description of their own funeral, narrowly avoided. Admiral Halsey received the final report at 3rd Fleet headquarters and immediately pulled England from submarine hunting for good. The argument over risking a valuable, experienced crew finally settled by a record too complete to argue with any further. 6 kills was enough. It was more than enough. It was a number that would be studied, copied, and taught to sonar operators and Hedgehog crews across the entire Pacific Fleet for the remainder of the war. In July 1944, England received the Presidential Unit Citation, one of only 3 destroyer escorts to earn that honor in the entire conflict. The citation read, in part, for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy Japanese submarines. The words were accurate. They were also, in a way, too small for what the ship and her crew had actually done. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, sent his own message once the full patrol report reached Washington, a line that would outlive every ship that ever carried the name. There will always be an England in the United States Navy. It spread through the fleet within days, repeated in wardrooms from the Solomons to Pearl Harbor, a promise from the top of the entire Navy that this ship, and the name she carried, would never be allowed to disappear. Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton received the Navy Cross that August, a single decoration for 6 submarines, for a crew that had gone from untested to legendary in 12 days without ever losing a man in combat during the entire hunt. The citation mentioned tactical skill and discipline under fire. It did not mention the thing that had actually carried England through 6 separate engagements against 6 separate commanders, each one smarter and more careful than the last. Pendleton had trusted mathematics when the rest of the fleet still trusted tradition. He had run firing solutions while veteran captains relied on instinct built from decades of depth-charge warfare that no longer applied to the weapon mounted on his own foredeck. The numbers had been right every single time. England continued on, escorting convoys and screening carriers through the summer and fall of 1944, her decks quieter now, her crew rotating out one by one as the war moved on without them. She never found another submarine. She never fired Hedgehog in combat again. The 12 days off Bougainville and the Admiralty Islands remained the only chapter of her war that history would remember, and for a long time it seemed like it might be the only chapter that mattered. Then, on May 9, 1945, off the coast of Okinawa, 3 kamikaze aircraft turned toward England during the brutal air battles of the invasion. Anti-aircraft fire from her own gun crews brought down the first attacker, tracers arcing up into a sky already thick with smoke from 100 other ships fighting the same battle. But the burning wreckage kept coming anyway, momentum alone carrying it down into the hull just below the bridge. 37 of her crew were killed or listed as missing. 25 more were wounded. The ship that had once absorbed 6 underwater explosions from her own Hedgehog attacks without losing a single sailor now lay heavily damaged, fires burning through compartments that had once held men celebrating a record no one believed possible. The same passageways where sailors had once compared stories of oil slicks and debris now filled with smoke, and the sounds of damage control parties fighting to keep her afloat. The damage was catastrophic enough that repairs would have cost more than building an entirely new destroyer escort from scratch. The Navy made its decision quickly. England was towed to Manus Island, stripped of anything still useful, and left to wait out the remainder of the war as surplus, her hull sitting quietly in a harbor far from the ocean where she had once made naval history. The war ended 3 months later without her. In November 1946, she was cut apart in a scrapyard, her steel sold as salvage, the ship that sank 6 submarines in 12 days, ending her existence as sheet metal and scrap, no different in the end from 1,000 other hulls that never sank a single enemy vessel. The record she left behind has never been matched. Not in the Atlantic, where Hedgehog eventually helped sink 47 German U-boats by the end of the war. Not in the Pacific, where hundreds of other destroyer escorts hunted submarines for years, without coming close to 6 kills in 12 days. 80 years later, no ship in any navy has equaled what Pendleton's crew did between May 19th and May 31st, 1944. Walton Pendleton survived the war. He was promoted, given command of an escort division in the North Pacific during the war's final year, and spent that year hunting Japanese submarines that never surfaced to give him a 7th kill. The war he had helped shorten by proving Hedgehog's worth ended in August 1945, while he was still out there, still running the same calculations, still watching scopes that stayed stubbornly empty. He retired from the Navy in 1961 after 34 years of service, and died in 1973 at the age of 66. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, among thousands of other veterans whose gravestones give no hint of what they did to earn their place there. His own gravestone records his rank and his decorations. It does not mention 6 submarines. It does not mention 12 days that changed how the entire United States Navy hunted its enemies beneath the surface of the ocean, or the young, untested captain who trusted a distrusted weapon when every instinct in the fleet told him not to. Admiral King's promise held for a while. In October 1960, a new guided missile destroyer leader was commissioned under the same name, DLG-22, later reclassified as the cruiser CG-22, USS England. She served for 32 years, longer than the original ship had lasted from her keel laying to her scrapping. But when CG-22 was decommissioned in 1994, the name left the fleet with her, and no ship has carried it since. 3 decades after Admiral King promised there would always be an England in the United States Navy, the promise quietly expired, unnoticed by almost everyone except the handful of historians still tracking what had happened off Bougainville half a century earlier. Today, one of the original Hedgehog launchers sits in storage at the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington, D.C., rusted, largely unnoticed by the visitors who walk past it toward the battleships and the aircraft carriers that dominate the galleries around it. Few placards mention the ship that proved the weapon worked, the young untested captain who trusted numbers over instinct, or the 335 men who went down with 6 submarines in 12 days because one small, cheaply built destroyer escort refused to lose faith in a weapon nobody else believed in. No monument marks the exact patch of ocean north of Bougainville and the Admiralty Islands where it happened. No annual ceremony gathers what remains of the crew who lived through it. There is only the record itself, unbroken for more than 80 years, and the quiet fact that somewhere in the archives of 2 navies, the names of 6 submarines and 335 men are still listed exactly where Pendleton's crew put them in the last 2 weeks of May 1944. The mathematics were simple. The men who trusted them were not ordinary at all.